You stare at a shelf filled with Bibles, each one carrying the same 4 familiar names, and something quietly unsettles you. You realize that you have repeated those names your entire life without ever asking how you came to trust them. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They sound so familiar that questioning them almost feels strange, almost disrespectful, as if familiarity itself has become evidence. Then someone asks a question so ordinary that it feels almost embarrassing you never considered it before. How do we actually know who wrote these books? Not what tradition says, not what you have always heard. How do we know? That question lingers because it reaches beyond religion. It touches something deeply human. We all inherit stories before we learn to investigate them. We inherit family traditions, national myths, cultural assumptions, political loyalties and religious beliefs long before we develop the tools to evaluate them. Most of us spend our early years absorbing certainty rather than examining it. That is not a criticism. It is simply how human beings survive. Every child trusts someone before they can verify anything. But eventually there comes a moment when trust and investigation meet each other, and that meeting is rarely comfortable. It is one thing to believe because everyone around you believes. It is another thing to understand why they believe. Those are not the same experience. They only feel identical until someone asks the question you have avoided. The remarkable thing about the Gospels is that they have shaped civilizations, inspired acts of extraordinary compassion, influenced laws, transformed lives, and remained among the most influential writings in history. Yet when historians study them, they ask different questions than believers often ask. A historian does not begin by asking whether a text is spiritually true. A historian asks where it came from, who produced it, when it was written, what sources it may have used, how it circulated, and how later communities understood it. Those questions are not attacks. They are the same questions historians ask about every ancient document, whether it comes from Greece, Rome, Egypt, Persia, or anywhere else. This difference in perspective often surprises people because many assume that questioning authorship automatically means rejecting the value of the text. But those are separate conversations. A book can profoundly influence humanity, regardless of whether every detail of its origin is certain. Likewise, uncertainty about authorship does not automatically determine whether its religious claims are true or false. Human beings often struggle with this distinction because we instinctively connect certainty in one area with certainty everywhere else. We want clean answers. Reality rarely provides them. One reason the question of authorship becomes emotionally charged is that identity quietly enters the conversation long before evidence does. Imagine someone who has spent decades hearing that the Gospel according to Matthew was written directly by the disciple Matthew. That idea is not merely historical information. It becomes part of their understanding of Scripture, family traditions, church life, childhood memories, and personal faith. When someone introduces scholarly debate, it can feel less like a discussion about manuscripts and more like an attack on everything familiar. Psychology has long recognized this tendency. We rarely defend isolated facts. We defend the identities attached to those facts. Once a belief becomes woven into who we are, questioning it feels surprisingly similar to questioning ourselves. That emotional response is not unique to religion. It happens in politics, science, culture, and everyday life. People cling to ideas because abandoning them sometimes feels like abandoning their community. Yet history is filled with examples showing that sincere people can disagree honestly while examining the same evidence. That is exactly what happens with the Gospels. Traditional Christian teaching attributes them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those attributions became well established in the early centuries of Christianity and were accepted by many early church leaders. At the same time, many modern historians point out that the texts themselves are formally anonymous. The names appear as titles associated with the books through early Christian tradition rather than as self-identifications within the narratives themselves. From that observation, scholars begin asking additional questions. When were these texts written? How close were the authors to the events they describe? Were they eyewitnesses, companions of eyewitnesses, or later members of Christian communities preserving earlier traditions? Different scholars answer those questions differently, and those answers often depend on how they evaluate literary patterns, historical references, language, and the testimony of early Christian writers. Consider the Gospel traditionally attributed to Mark. Many historians view it as the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels. One reason is that much of its material appears in different forms within Matthew and Luke. This observation led to the widely discussed hypothesis that Matthew and Luke may have used Mark as one of their sources, along with other traditions that are now lost or otherwise unknown. That does not prove the traditional attribution wrong, nor does it prove every alternative theory correct. It simply illustrates how scholars attempt to explain literary relationships using the evidence available. The Gospel traditionally attributed to Matthew contains material shared with Mark, but it also includes distinctive teachings and narratives. Some researchers argue that this reflects a community preserving traditions associated with Matthew rather than direct authorship by the disciple himself. Others maintain that traditional attribution remains plausible, especially when considered alongside early Christian testimony. Similar discussions surround Luke, whose Gospel and the Book of Acts share style, vocabulary, and narrative continuity. The traditional view identifies Luke as a companion of the Apostle Paul, while historians examine linguistic features, historical references, and theological themes to understand the author's background. The Gospel traditionally attributed to John often generates its own unique discussions because its style, chronology, and theological emphasis differ noticeably from the other 3 Gospels. Some scholars argue that it reflects the testimony of an eyewitness shaped through a particular community, while others suggest a more complex process involving multiple stages of composition or editorial development. None of these discussions exist because historians enjoy creating uncertainty. They exist because ancient history frequently leaves incomplete evidence. Unlike modern books, ancient works rarely arrived with publishing contracts, author interviews, copyright pages, and preserved drafts. Historians reconstruct the past by assembling fragments, comparing manuscripts, studying language, evaluating external testimony, and acknowledging where certainty ends. That willingness to admit uncertainty can feel uncomfortable because modern culture often rewards confidence more than careful reasoning. Yet intellectual honesty sometimes requires saying that the evidence points in a direction without removing every possible question. This is where psychology quietly returns. Human beings often mistake confidence for accuracy. Someone speaking with absolute certainty can appear more convincing than someone carefully explaining probabilities and limitations. But history is not improved by louder voices. It is improved by better questions. The story of the Gospels reminds us that important conversations often resist simple conclusions. For some believers, the authority of these texts rests primarily on theological conviction rather than on modern historical methods. For others, historical investigation deepens rather than weakens appreciation because it reveals the remarkable journey through which these writings were preserved and transmitted. Still others remain unconvinced by either position and continue exploring the evidence. Each approach reflects different assumptions about knowledge, faith, and history. The deeper question may not be whether uncertainty exists. It may be how we respond when it does. Do we become defensive because uncertainty feels threatening, or do we become curious because uncertainty invites learning? That choice shapes far more than our view of ancient texts. It shapes the kind of thinkers we become. Every generation inherits conclusions. Every generation also decides whether to examine them. The conversation about who wrote the Gospels ultimately reveals something about us, as much as it reveals something about the documents themselves. We all want firm ground beneath our feet. We all prefer stories with clear endings and uncomplicated heroes. But history rarely offers that luxury. Instead, it invites patience, humility, and the willingness to separate what we know, what we reasonably infer, what tradition preserves, and what remains uncertain. Those distinctions do not diminish the importance of the conversation. They make it more meaningful because they encourage us to pursue understanding rather than simply defend assumptions. If these questions challenge you, not to abandon belief but to examine it with greater care, then continue asking them. Independent thinking begins not with rejecting tradition, but with understanding why it exists and how it developed. If you enjoy exploring difficult historical and philosophical questions with evidence, nuance, and intellectual curiosity, consider subscribing and joining future conversations that value careful thinking over easy certainty. The moment you realize that intelligent, well-informed people can examine the same historical evidence and still reach different conclusions, another uncomfortable question appears. If the evidence is the same, why do the conclusions differ? The easy answer is to assume that one side is honest and the other is dishonest. That explanation feels satisfying because it protects us from complexity. But history rarely works that way. More often, disagreements begin long before anyone looks at the evidence. They begin with assumptions about how history should be evaluated, how ancient sources should be weighed, and what counts as convincing proof. Imagine two detectives investigating the same cold case with only fragments of evidence left behind. Neither detective has security footage, recorded interviews, or forensic reports collected on the day of the event. Instead, they have copies of documents, references made decades later, patterns in language and testimony preserved by later communities. One detective gives greater weight to long-standing tradition unless there is strong evidence against it. The other begins with greater skepticism and asks whether later traditions may have developed over time. Neither approach is automatically irrational. Each reflects a different starting point. The discussion surrounding the Gospels often unfolds in a similar way. One of the most significant observations made by many biblical scholars is that the earliest surviving manuscripts of the Gospels do not include personal introductions in which the authors explicitly identify themselves in the modern sense. Instead, the familiar titles associated with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John appear through the manuscript tradition and early Christian testimony. From there, scholars ask why these particular names became attached to these texts. Some argue that the consistency of these attributions across early Christian communities suggests they preserve authentic historical memory. Others respond that traditions can become firmly established even when they develop after the original composition of a work. The debate continues not because one side refuses to think, but because ancient evidence often leaves room for interpretation. Another layer involves the way oral tradition functioned in the ancient world. Modern readers sometimes underestimate how different memory operated in cultures where written material was relatively uncommon. Today, people instinctively reach for a phone whenever they forget a date, a quotation, or a name. In the first century, memory was cultivated with remarkable discipline. Stories were repeated publicly, teachings were recited regularly, and communities became living libraries. This does not mean oral tradition guaranteed perfect preservation. Human memory is still human memory. Details can shift, emphasis can change, and different audiences may hear different aspects of the same event. But neither does it mean oral tradition was inherently unreliable. It occupied a respected and essential place in ancient societies. This creates another important distinction. Historical reliability is not the same as photographic precision. Ancient biographies were often written to communicate the significance of a person's life as well as the sequence of events. Writers arranged material, emphasized themes, and selected episodes that supported the larger portrait they wished to present. Modern readers sometimes expect the Gospels to resemble contemporary journalism. Many historians instead compare them to ancient biographies, a literary genre with different conventions and expectations. Recognizing this context does not settle every historical question, but it helps explain why differences between parallel accounts do not automatically imply fabrication. Different witnesses to the same event often remember different details even today. Anyone who has spoken with several people after a traffic accident or a family gathering knows this instinctively. Their stories overlap, but they are rarely identical. The psychological tendency to expect perfect agreement is itself revealing. We often believe that truth should eliminate every variation. Reality suggests otherwise. Another reason the authorship question remains fascinating is that it reveals how communities preserve identity. Every community tells stories about its origins. Families do it. Nations do it. Universities do it. Religious traditions do it. These stories create continuity between generations. They answer the question of where we came from before we begin asking where we are going. The earliest Christians lived in a world where memories of Jesus were shared through preaching, worship, conversation, and eventually written accounts. Those communities naturally valued knowing where these traditions originated. Whether every attribution reflects direct authorship or a close association with apostolic testimony remains debated, but few scholars dispute that early Christians cared deeply about preserving what they believed had been handed down to them. That concern itself becomes part of the historical picture. At the same time, modern textual criticism has revealed something equally remarkable. Although thousands of New Testament manuscripts contain differences in spelling, wording, and small details, the existence of these variations does not necessarily imply that the text is unknowable. On the contrary, the large number of manuscripts often allows scholars to compare readings and reconstruct the earliest attainable form of the text with considerable confidence in many passages. This surprises people who assume that discovering textual variants automatically destroys confidence in the New Testament. The reality is more nuanced. Some differences are minor, some are more significant. Most do not alter the central narrative of the Gospels, while a small number continue to be discussed extensively by specialists. Once again, the historical picture is more complicated than either complete certainty or complete skepticism. Complexity rarely produces viral headlines, but it often produces better history. There is another psychological lesson hidden within this conversation. People tend to search for evidence that confirms what they already believe. This tendency, commonly called confirmation bias, affects everyone. A committed skeptic may notice every historical difficulty while overlooking evidence that supports traditional views. A committed believer may emphasize supportive evidence while minimizing unresolved questions. Neither reaction is unique to religion. Investors do it with financial markets. Sports fans do it with referees. Voters do it during elections. The human mind naturally organizes information in ways that protect existing beliefs. Recognizing that tendency is not a sign of weakness. It is one of the first steps toward intellectual humility. The healthiest historical inquiry asks not only whether the evidence supports my position, but also what evidence might challenge it. That question is far more difficult because it requires a willingness to experience temporary uncertainty. Yet uncertainty is not always an enemy. Sometimes it is the doorway to deeper understanding. Perhaps the greatest misconception surrounding this topic is the belief that history exists to eliminate faith, or that faith exists to eliminate history. Many thoughtful believers welcome historical investigation because they see no contradiction between careful scholarship and sincere religious conviction. Likewise, many non-believers study the Gospels with respect because of their extraordinary historical influence, even if they do not accept their theological claims. The conversation becomes most productive when participants recognize that historical methods and theological commitments answer different kinds of questions. History asks, what can reasonably be concluded from surviving evidence? Theology asks what those events ultimately mean. Those questions overlap, but they are not identical. Confusing them often creates unnecessary conflict. The deeper challenge is not deciding which conclusion feels most comfortable. It is learning to live honestly with the evidence as it exists, even when it refuses to satisfy every expectation. That discipline extends far beyond the Gospels. It shapes how we evaluate every important claim we encounter. The willingness to distinguish evidence from assumption, probability from certainty, and tradition from demonstration is one of the most valuable habits a person can develop. It does not guarantee that every conclusion will be correct. It simply makes it more likely that our conclusions are shaped by careful thought rather than inherited confidence. As the discussion about who wrote the Gospels continues across universities, churches, and conversations around the world, perhaps the most enduring lesson is not that every question has an easy answer. It is that honest inquiry is compatible with humility. We can recognize the immense historical and spiritual importance of these texts, while also acknowledging that some questions remain open to interpretation. That willingness to hold conviction together with curiosity may be one of the rarest qualities in any age. It asks us to become less interested in defending our identity at all costs and more interested in following the evidence wherever it reasonably leads, even when the path is slower, more complicated, and far less comfortable than we expected. Eventually, the conversation stops being about ancient manuscripts and starts becoming about you. Not because the historical questions disappear, but because you begin to notice something unsettling about the way your own mind works. You realize that the question of who wrote the Gospels is only one example of a much larger pattern. Human beings are remarkably good at confusing familiarity with certainty. The longer an idea has been part of our lives, the more natural it feels. And the more natural it feels, the less likely we are to ask where it came from. That instinct is not unique to religion. It shapes how we think about politics, family traditions, cultural values, morality, success, failure, and even our own identities. We inherit frameworks before we inherit questions. We learn what is considered obvious before we learn how to evaluate what is true. Most of us never notice that process because it happens so early and so quietly. By the time we become adults, many of our deepest assumptions feel less like conclusions and more like reality itself. That is why difficult questions can feel surprisingly personal. They do not merely challenge information. They challenge the invisible structure that organizes our understanding of the world. When historians continue debating the origins of the Gospels after generations of scholarship, some people find that frustrating. They want a final verdict that removes every uncertainty. Yet history rarely offers that kind of certainty. Ancient documents almost never arrive with complete documentation explaining every stage of their composition, transmission, and preservation. Instead, historians compare manuscripts, analyze language, examine archaeological context, study references from early writers, and build conclusions that remain open to revision if stronger evidence emerges. That process is not a weakness. It is one of the strengths of historical inquiry. It accepts that our knowledge grows through careful investigation, rather than through the assumption that every answer must already be complete. In that sense, the debate over gospel authorship reflects the broader nature of historical scholarship itself. There are areas where a broad scholarly consensus exists, areas where significant disagreement remains, and areas where the available evidence simply does not allow absolute conclusions. Learning to distinguish among those categories is an intellectual skill that extends far beyond this subject. One of the most valuable lessons this discussion offers is the difference between confidence and certainty. Confidence can be reasonable even when certainty is impossible. Historians routinely reach well-supported conclusions without claiming mathematical proof. They evaluate probabilities rather than demanding impossibilities. In everyday life, we already accept this standard. We trust that many events in ancient history occurred, even though no living witness remains. We reconstruct the past through documents, material evidence, and the convergence of independent sources. The same approach is applied to the Gospels. Some scholars conclude that the traditional attributions are historically credible. Others believe the evidence points toward anonymous authors, writing within communities connected to apostolic traditions. Still others occupy positions somewhere between those views. What is important is recognizing that these conclusions emerge from arguments about evidence, not simply from personal preference. Understanding why different scholars disagree can be more illuminating than memorizing which side they support. It teaches us how historical reasoning actually works. There is also a tendency to imagine that changing one's mind is a sign of weakness. In reality, history often advances because people are willing to revise earlier conclusions when better evidence appears. That willingness does not require abandoning deeply held beliefs every time a new theory is proposed. It requires something more balanced. It requires refusing to treat either tradition or novelty as automatically correct. New ideas can be insightful, but they can also be mistaken. Long-held traditions can preserve authentic memory, but they can also include developments that occurred over time. Neither age nor originality determines truth by itself. Evidence must still be weighed carefully. That principle protects us from two opposite errors. One is believing something simply because it has always been believed. The other is rejecting something simply because it is old. Independent thinking does not automatically favor the familiar or the unfamiliar. It evaluates both with the same intellectual honesty. Another surprising aspect of this discussion is that it reminds us how collaborative knowledge really is. None of us personally examined every ancient manuscript. None of us individually excavated archaeological sites across the Eastern Mediterranean. We rely on communities of experts who dedicate decades to studying languages, history, literature, and material culture. Yet even experts disagree, and that can feel unsettling. We often imagine expertise as producing unanimous certainty. More often, expertise produces better questions, narrower disagreements, and a clearer understanding of where the strongest evidence lies. That is progress, even when complete agreement remains elusive. The existence of debate is not proof that nothing can be known. Sometimes it simply reflects the complexity of the evidence. The Gospels themselves remain extraordinary historical documents, regardless of where one ultimately lands on the question of authorship. They provide our earliest extended narratives about the life, teachings, death, and reported resurrection of Jesus. They influenced literature, philosophy, ethics, law, art, music, and culture on a scale that is difficult to overstate. Their historical significance does not depend solely on resolving every question about their composition. Likewise, for many believers, their spiritual significance rests not only on historical arguments, but also on theological conviction and lived religious experience. For many non-believers, they remain indispensable sources for understanding the origins of Christianity and the ancient world. Recognizing these different perspectives allows the conversation to become richer rather than more polarized. Perhaps the most important realization comes when you stop asking whether uncertainty is something to fear. Uncertainty is uncomfortable because it denies us the illusion of complete control. Yet it also creates the possibility of genuine learning. A person who refuses to question anything may preserve certainty, but they also risk preserving error. A person who questions everything without discipline may lose the ability to reach any stable conclusion at all. Wisdom lies somewhere between those extremes. It requires enough humility to recognize the limits of our knowledge and enough courage to continue seeking understanding anyway. That balance is difficult because it asks us to live without the false comfort of absolute simplicity. When conversations about religion become hostile, they often reveal more about human psychology than about history itself. People sometimes argue as though admitting uncertainty means surrendering everything they value. Others argue as though finding uncertainty automatically disproves every religious claim. Neither conclusion follows logically. Historical investigation and theological belief intersect, but they are not identical enterprises. One asks what the surviving evidence most reasonably supports. The other asks what ultimate meaning those events hold. Appreciating that distinction allows for conversations that are both intellectually rigorous and respectful of differing convictions. In the end, the question of who really wrote the Gospels does not have a universally accepted answer that satisfies every historian, theologian, or reader. What it does offer is something equally valuable: an opportunity to practice careful thinking. It encourages us to separate inherited assumptions from examined conclusions, to distinguish confidence from certainty, and to recognize that sincere people can disagree while engaging honestly with the same body of evidence. That may be one of the most enduring lessons of all. The pursuit of truth is rarely a straight line. It is a process of asking better questions, listening carefully to competing arguments, acknowledging what is well supported, admitting what remains uncertain, and resisting the temptation to mistake conviction for proof. Whether you ultimately find yourself persuaded by traditional authorship, by one of the alternative scholarly models, or by a position somewhere in between, the deeper challenge remains the same. Be willing to examine the foundations of your beliefs with both curiosity and humility. Reality is not strengthened by our certainty, nor weakened by our questions. If anything, honest questions are often the beginning of deeper understanding. If you enjoy exploring history, philosophy, and the ideas that have shaped civilizations with evidence, nuance, and an open mind, consider subscribing and returning for more conversations that invite careful thinking instead of easy answers.